Hi everyone, and welcome to a new series of videos. And the next few videos, ladies and gentlemen, are going to be on, can you see that there, the Western Front, all to do with World War I, the Western Front, the trenches. And hopefully this series of videos will help you to prepare for the exam on the Western Front. Now, before we actually get to the Western Front itself, I think we need to have a general understanding about World War I. So here's a quick overview of World War I. Now, June the 28th, 1914, two people were assassinated. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife, Sophie. And they were shot and killed by a man called Gavrilo Princip, and he was a member of the Black Hand group. Now, June the 28th, two people were killed. Within a month, July the 28th, Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia, the first two countries involved. Within the next 7 days, Germany, France, Belgium, Britain, Russia, all the main powers of Europe had joined World War I. As a very famous historian wrote, he said, like a line of falling dominoes, the countries of Europe toppled into war. So, by August 1914, war was upon Europe. Now, that's better. The Foreign Secretary for Britain, a man called Sir Edward Grey, came out with a very, very famous phrase. Oh, that's quite bright. He said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He looked out of his window and he saw the people going along, lighting the street lamps, and he reversed it and said, "It's as if the lights were going out. Dark days were approaching Britain and Europe. Sir Edward Grey, we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He was unusual because he seemed to be suggesting that World War I was going to be quite a long war. That was unusual. Many people, remember it's August, many people thought that the war would all be over by Christmas 1914. They thought the war would be over. 4 months. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the war was over. Christmas 1918, 54 months. It lasted more than 4 years. Imagine if you were a year 7 going and joining your new secondary school, and then the war lasted until the Christmas that you were in year 11. So it was a long time. The Kaiser, the King of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, he said to his soldiers as they were marching off to war, he said, "You will be home before the leaves fall from the trees." Autumn, September, October, November. He also was mistaken. The war was not over by Christmas. It went on and on and on. And part of the reason for that, of course, was the trenches. And there'll be later videos on the trenches for you to understand that. But September 1914, we get the first battles. The Germans attacked, wearing their superb helmets. Look at that for a helmet, the Pickle House. And the Germans attacked and they pushed into France. And Britain had quite a small army over there, the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force. And the Germans pushed forward, and the French and the British went out to try and hold them. And they just about managed to hold them at the Battle of the Marne. Terrible amount of casualties. And at the Battle of the Marne, Germans' advance was held. And that led to the trenches, which we will be looking at later. So we move on. October, November 1914, we get the first battle of a place called Ypres. Ypres. And this was important because Ypres was the sort of main route to the ports at Calais and places like that, and Britain needed its ports to bring in reinforcements, so Britain had to hold Ypres. As we'll see, there were 3 battles throughout World War I, at least 3 at Ypres. So the first Ypres, Britain manages to hold, so it's got the Channel ports. April 1915, a new year. Second Battle of Ypres. Quite famous this time because for the first time during the war, gas was used. The Germans used gas. Later in the war, the British also used gas, a new weapon. We'll be looking at videos on that later. Still the same year, August 1915. We get a battle not in the Western Front, not in Flanders, Belgium and France, over the other side of Europe, over towards the east at a place called Gallipoli, where the British, helped by soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, tried to land and fight the Turkish troops because the Turks were helping the Germans. This was largely the idea of Winston Churchill. He was desperate, he said, to avoid chewing barbed wire on the Western Front. He thought if we can send our men round the other side, it'll drag the problem away from the Western Front. It didn't work. Gallipoli was a huge defeat. So we're now into 1916. Already the war had been going on for 2 years. Now again, the Germans are attacking the French at a place called Verdun. And they said, we are going to bleed the French army white at the Battle of Verdun. Now, there were huge casualties on both sides combined, over 1 million. Both sides together. And you could say really that the Germans did sort of succeed in bleeding the French white, because shortly afterwards the French army refused to fight. They mutinied. I suppose instead of saying at Verdun, you could say it was almost as if they were nearly done or overdone. But Verdun was a huge battle, and the French were desperate for Britain to somehow help them. Now they couldn't support them at Verdun, but they said, if you attack further away, down here at the Somme, if you attack there, the Germans will have to drag their men away and it will give us some relief. So we get July the 1st, 1916, one of the most famous battles, the Battle of the Somme. 1916, the British fighting the Germans, trying to help the French. Now, the Somme was such an important day that here's a book, look how thick that book is. And it's all about one day, the first day of the Somme, 1st of July. And in all the battles that the British Army had ever fought in history, this was the day where they suffered their heaviest losses. Almost 20,000 dead, almost 40,000 wounded on one day. The Battle of the Somme, the trenches. Now the Battle of the Somme lasted on and off till November. And again there were huge casualties, 420,000 on the British side, as many on the German side. At the end of the battle, the front line, Britain had managed to advance 5 miles in about 5 months. A huge amount of casualties. Was it worth it? Well, there's a controversy. Some people say yes, some people say no. Of course, in the end, it did help to win the war. But the price, on that very first day, the battalion from Leeds, the PALS battalion from Leeds attacked. There were about 750 men. By the end of the day, only 50 were unharmed in some way. Out of 750, a huge price to pay. The Battle of the Somme. We'll be dealing with that later. In the same year, 1916, the Battle of Jutland, one of the very, very few battles to take place in World War I at sea. The British fleet against the German fleet. Now, Again, there's an argument about who won. Certainly, the Germans sank more ships than the British did. And indeed, one of the leaders, Admiral Beatty, said, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today," as they were sinking. But after the Battle of Jutland, the Germans never ever left the port again, so the British fleet was able to control the sea, and the British fleet was able to blockade Germany, and it would then suffer a food shortage, which played a part towards the end of the war. Jutland, 1916. We're on to 1917 now, the Battle of Arras. Finally, there's a sort of little ridge, and the British and the Canadians take the ridge at Vimy Ridge. But again, there's high casualties. Throughout that Battle of Arras, we'll look at it later, the British, on average, 4,000 casualties per day. So casualties seem to be a big issue in World War I. We'll look at that when we look at the medicine. Same year, April 1917, America joined the war. Now, why did that happen? A couple of reasons. Germany was sinking the American ships, their submarines, the U-boats were sinking the ships, and Germany had sent a telegram to Mexico, the Zimmermann telegram, saying to Mexico, look, if you join us, you can have part of America. So America came into the war in 1917 to help the British and the French and the Russians. We get to the third Battle of Ypres, sometimes called Passchendaele, sometimes called the Battle of Mud. Have a look there. The weather was absolutely dreadful. The third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele. Again, terrible, terrible amounts of casualties. And one man who fought at this battle, a man called Harry Patch, he was the last surviving British soldier from the British trenches. He died in the year 2009, aged 111. Wow. And he said, towards the end of his life, war isn't worth one life. I'll just leave that one with you. And when the leader of the British Armed Forces, a man called Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, when he went to Passchendaele after the battle was over, he said, "Good God, did we really send men to fight in that?" And he was talking about the conditions, the terrain, the mud. We'll deal with that in another video. Still in the same year, November 1917, a battle at Cambrai. Again, one of the key battles we'll look at later. And in this battle, it's the first battle really where they properly used tanks. And they were able to take land quite quickly. In the end, the British lost it again because they didn't know how to reinforce. But at the time, tanks seemed to be a new weapon. Rather than just slogging through the mud, they're using tanks. Maybe the British said, "Thanks for that." Terrible, sorry about that. So, new ideas were finally coming through, but we've already been fighting for over 3 years. It wasn't all over by Christmas. And then, ladies and gentlemen, still in the same year, we get the Russian Revolution. The Russians have been fighting the Germans over in Eastern Europe. And the Russians, the Communist Party, led by a man called Lenin, they had a slogan saying, look, we need peace, bread and land. And the Russians made their peace with Germany. 1917, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And Germany took a lot of land, but at least Russia said we've got peace and we can rebuild our country. But of course, with Russia out of the war, the Germans were able to bring all their soldiers from the east and bring them to the Western Front. So things were changing finally as we move into 1918. And in the spring, the Germans launched a big offensive, the Spring Offensive, sometimes called Operation Michael. And because they've got these extra troops, they break through and they push forward, and it looked quite bad. My goodness, for the British, for the French, are we going to lose the war after all this time? The Germans are pushing forward. Fortunately, there's some American reinforcements coming in. Ironically, as the Germans pushed forward, they got further and further away from their supplies. As they pushed forward, they found alcohol and they started to drink it. They're too far away from their supplies. They can't get resupplied. So the British, the French, the Americans counterattack. And it's called the 100 Days. And they push the Germans all the way back. The Germans are suffering from low morale. Back at home, they're hearing, we've got no food because the British ships were blockading Germany. The German Navy mutinied and they said, no, we're not going to do anything. So their morale is going down and down and down. 4th of July 1918, Ludendorff, one of the top German generals, he called it the Black Day for the German army because the British, the French, the Americans pushed so far through their big line of defence called the Hindenburg Line. Germany was going to lose. They could not win the war. What happened towards the end? Battle of Amiens. Another battle where we use our tanks, and it's showing that the Germans cannot cope with this. Finally, in November, on the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, peace comes to Europe. It wasn't over by Christmas. It was over 4 years later. And the French make the Germans sign the surrender in a train carriage in France. Back in Germany, in a German hospital, there's one German soldier, and he's blinded because he's been affected by the gas. And he hears that the Germans have surrendered, and he beats his pillow in the hospital in frustration, and he bursts into tears. And that man's name? Adolf Hitler. And he vowed revenge. And in World War II, when Germany made France surrender in 1940, Hitler made sure they used the same train carriage to sign the surrender. History linking together. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. A very, very quick run through of the First World War. Hopefully it gives you an overview. Over the next few videos, we'll be looking in far more detail at some of the key areas that they'll probably ask you about in the exam. So, stay tuned. Hopefully it'll be useful. All the best now. Speak to you soon.